Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 29 of Series 7. The question for today is, can value states have priority over other ideals like happiness or knowledge? The reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 2, Section 7. So we have recently been discussing the inadequacy of ethics, both as a moral category and as a justification of life. And that analysis produced the principle of an affirmation or will to value leading to value sufficiency. But we haven't explained the pathway from the experience of life to that conclusion. That pathway involves a number of steps, selections and choices that we must now explain and justify. In the beginning of such a journey, we have a physicalist conception of human life and the world as bodies and objects. From this grows an awareness of subjectivity and of consciousness as an integrating idea. Then this leads to a differentiation between different kinds of mental states and experiences. The standard classification in analytic philosophy is that of cognitive and non-cognitive mental states. But this classification contains a cognitivist bias and defines non-cognitive states negatively. So I supplement this classification with the four categories of cognition, affect, will and value. We can also note various modes of cognition. Two of these are analytic or logical and phenomenological or immediate modes of cognition. Interestingly, Buddhism accounts also argue for two modes of cognition, inference and perception. And because value is my key concept, I find numerous types and differentiations of value. Some types may be just applications like ethical, economic, aesthetic, religious and scientific values. Then there are perspectival, motivational and experiential values. Sometimes the word value is used analogously, like in truth values or numerical values of quantification. Whether valid or invalid, this kind of value isn't relevant to my investigation of human experience. Other questions about values are whether they are graduated or binary, or are they affective or cognitive? More relevantly, are values subjective or objective, or are they attributed, instrumental or intrinsic? The notion of intrinsic value is significant here because it is related to my proposal of sufficient value. Intrinsic value is contested, but in my view only mental states and people are candidates of intrinsic value. My proposed sufficient value has intrinsic value as well as other properties. That is, it's sufficient to the particular requirements of life, but it isn't a matter of quantification or maximization. Sufficient value is held to have properties like quality, absence, alterity and vulnerability. The above is an indication of the pathway leading to the state of value sufficiency. We now need to work through these states until we arrive at that conclusion. To start at the beginning, we need to reiterate the physicalist conception of life and the world as bodies and objects. That is, at its most basic, animals don't recognize their own existence or conscious states of other creatures. And on evolutionary and developmental perspectives, species and individuals acquire consciousness gradually. For humans, this has been tracked by developmental psychologists like Jean Piaget and John Bowlby. Historians and philosophers have also tracked a growing awareness in human beings of their own subjectivity. In ethics, development is evident from the ethics of might is right to rule directed behaviour, and to an appreciation of subjective intention and beyond. Even the recent advent of psychology is an indication of a growing awareness of subjectivity. And in modern times, we find further indications of a development of an awareness of subjectivity. In the 19th century, for example, science was thought to be objective, but it is now known to be value-laden, and phenomenology still criticises science for overlooking the presence of subjective observers. It's a matter of debate whether such neglect is at the root of behaviourism and a physicalist philosophy of mind. It's less questionable that subjectivity is neglected in the many material objectives pursued by modern humans. One common form of this neglect is being unaware of one's own values, feelings and emotions. And in the pursuit of happiness, people are often fixated on the means rather than pursuing the end. In these workshops and other settings, I meet a lot of people with great enthusiasm for particular theories, but few people can focus on the experience that has been produced by those theories. I recently gave a presentation on Tai Nguyen's concept of value collapse, which explains this idea, and I have spent a lot of time discussing supporting cognitive frameworks of value states. The above are examples of both neglect and growing awareness of humans' subjectivity, and that growing awareness of subjectivity can be expressed in the idea of consciousness as an integrating idea. Consciousness is an integrating idea because it represents subjectivity and our growing awareness of it, and it also brings together its constituents of cognitive, affect, volitional and value states. Before examining these four mental states, I want to review a couple of other items as human objectives. One of them is Heidegger's notion of being as a human objective or guiding principle. But I should first point out several objections I have to Heidegger's notion of being. One is that the idea of being seems to be a reification, hypostatization and category mistake, as noted by Gilbert Ryle. That is, the totality of things in the world is just a totality. It isn't a separate category described as being. John Searle goes so far as to say that if you can use being as a noun, or worse yet being, you are in serious intellectual difficulties. Heidegger also regards the question of being as having ontological priority over the ontical sciences. Ontology refers to the fundamental existence of things like the world and consciousness. Ontic refers to particular expressions in such forms as physical, historical and sociological events. But we can legitimately ask, how is that priority justified? In the natural world, laws of physics are prerequisite to understanding sequences of natural events, and the fact of existence is logically and ontologically prior to further understanding. But for being as an objective, hierarchies of explanation or necessary sequences of events aren't enough. This is because we aren't just dealing with an explanation or an ontology, but a preference of human choice. That is, logical, ontological, or physical priority does not vindicate evaluative priority. Yet a redeeming feature of Heidegger's notion of being is its inclusion of Dasein as human existence. Heidegger rejects the term consciousness as a misleading idea described by Sartre as being for itself. Yet in these contexts, the idea of consciousness as a being in the world is given significance, and the priority of being as consciousness is also established by human self-consciousness. Subjectivity and consciousness are thereby given prominence in the phenomenologies of Heidegger and Sartre. Consciousness is also a New Age objective and is made a principle of ethics by Thomas Metzinger, and it is often thought to have intrinsic value, but I will challenge this shortly. For such reasons, consciousness is often regarded as a human objective, as well as because of its integrative character. That is, consciousness defines the parameters of human existence, of everything within it or related to it. And if something is related to consciousness, it must be through the capacities of cognition, affect, will, and value. But despite its possible representation of what constitutes a human being is, its intrinsic value is questionable. Will, choice, and value may be inherent to consciousness, but they may not substantiate intrinsic value. And consciousness may not always be of value as a representation of a person, as it seems to be the case in suicide. Also, as argued, intrinsic values can be trivial without sufficient value to be an objective. And consciousness has other problems that we have yet to discuss. With respect to suicide, the intrinsic value of consciousness might be unconscious, innate, or exist objectively. But this response poses unconscious, innate, or objective value, which are themselves extremely contentious. Another problem is that even of intrinsic value, what specifically would make it a valid human objective? What property of consciousness would provide the feature that might render it a human objective? Its general character seems to prevent any specific property being named as an objective. A couple of candidate properties are personal identity and intrinsic value. But intrinsic value has been put in question by the above, and personal identity is anachronistic as an objective. And if the property we are looking for is its potential for development, then that appears to be a quantification of consciousness rather than a property. Yet the development of consciousness does afford us the capacities to try to resolve problems. That is, capacities like reason, perspective, abstraction, creativity, intuition, and perception. But the problem for consciousness as a human objective, which should bring solutions, is that it's problematic. That is, its increase incurs problems like anxiety, anomie, alienation, fragmentation, guilt, and sorrow. But many of the problems for human beings in the world are patently obvious, but phenomenology can reveal how the inherent structures of consciousness are intrinsically problematic. For example, the structure of temporality reveals how movement through time produces impermanence and challenges from the flux of an ever-changing matrix. Then the divisibility of consciousness threatens fragmentation, schizophrenia, fission and split brain phenomena. And graduation subjects us to diminutions of capacity as well as the final diminution of death. We aren't making value judgments here, but speaking of matters of fact about possibilities and their neglect. But value judgments do come into play with respect to choosing cognition, affect, will or value. And we can first examine the choice for affect states like pleasure or happiness as a human objective. The significance of both pleasure and happiness are widely discussed in the context of utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham emphasized pleasure, whereas Mill advocated the maximum forms of happiness. As social policy, the maximum happiness for the maximum number of people is difficult to dispute. Happiness is also a classic human objective and an undeniable human good that benefits human life. And it is also endorsed by consensus, the American Constitution, and Aristotelian and even Kantian ethics. But as a principle of ethics, happiness has serious inadequacies of quantification, justification and motivation. Yet the main limitation of happiness is its omission of experiences like meaning, purpose and wonder. A similar criticism is that happiness is blind. It doesn't answer the why or how of life. Yet Mill argues that we know that happiness is uniquely valuable because it's the only thing we desire for its own sake. But a serious criticism of happiness as an intrinsic or unique value is that it need not always be of value. That is, I could regard happiness as encouraging weakness, as a misguided objective, and so on. And if happiness need not always be of value, it could not have intrinsic value. I previously argued in depth against affect states like pleasure and happiness as principles of ethics or of life. But to avoid going through these arguments again, I can resort to quoting other people's views on the matter. Thomas Carlyle, for example, described utilitarianism as pig philosophy or a philosophy for swine. Others like Nietzsche, Slavoj Zizek, David Wiggins and Bernard Williams hold that the pursuit of happiness as a definitive objective is hugely misguided. To sum up, it's very nice to be happy, but the character of reflective human consciousness requires more than this. Human consciousness requires understanding, purpose and other things that happiness doesn't provide. We might then look to cognitive capacities like knowledge and truth to find what affect states cannot provide. Knowledge has been the primary principle in human development and science. Aristotle and Bernard Lonergan speak of an unrestricted desire to know, and knowledge as cognition is a necessary constituent of consciousness. These considerations render knowledge a primary candidate over other ideals. But knowledge is a cognitive state that in principle cannot harbour value or have intrinsic value. This exclusion is supported by the fact value and the cognitive non-cognitive distinctions. Facts may, however, be value laden or have value entanglement, but these aren't moral, motivational or intrinsic values. Cognitive states can also be contrasted to positive value states like love or self-esteem. Value states have intrinsic value because they inherently involve a process of valuation essential to such states. But that process of valuation isn't inherent to cognitive states, which therefore can't have intrinsic value. The question of the intrinsic value of knowledge also figures in the ongoing cognitivist, non-cognitivist debate. That is, how can we explain morals, motivation, purpose or meaning, etc., by knowledge or feeling? And here we must bring theories to bear such as of Hume, Moore and Mackey, as well as our own judgment. Kant viewed morality as deriving from reason, but Hume regarded reason as the slave of the passions. Likewise, John Mackey points to the tendency of the mind to project values onto the world. We can't resolve this debate either here or perhaps in the future, but I can pose a question. In the case of motivation, am I moved to eat an apple by a conception of the apple or the hunger to eat it? A non-cognitivist answer is implied because knowledge is a means but not an end that is valuable in itself. But this example is a huge simplification of an extensive debate. Yet some argue that knowledge does have intrinsic value, and particularly as a moral principle. For example, William Frankenna and John Finnis argues that knowledge has intrinsic value. But Finnis's argument is primarily against derived values and is also based on intuition and usefulness. So it's arguable whether Finnis's arguments are directed to the internal character of knowledge. But conversely, we can argue against the intrinsic value of knowledge as a cognitive state. For example, the attraction of value or of new ideas or inventions isn't due to their inherent cognitive content. This is evident in their waning appeal that is attributed to them only in anticipation or novelty. My view is that knowledge is a mode of cognition that can't be of intrinsic value or an adequate human objective. But knowledge certainly has practical value and can be considered in a supportive function of value states. And the idea and significance of knowledge draw upon the concept of truth that we must now examine. The traditional concept of truth is of an absolute ideal with objective and intrinsic value. But Nietzsche and others have challenged this view, and we can begin by considering truth as an anthropologically constructed cognitive concept. And as an abstract cognitive concept, it can be criticized in the same way as knowledge. That is, abstract cognitive concepts cannot have the intrinsic value of definitive objectives. Moreover, there are different theories of correspondence, coherence, pragmatic and redundancy theories of truth. This indicates that truth isn't a presuppositional absolute, but is attributed with value as a human artifact. Even Kant defined truth as a regulative concept that guides rather than determines or constitutes. Karl Popper also defined truth as a regulative idea, as it is unknowable, yet offering criteria of falsehood. Paniel Rees Cardenas finds truth as a regulative attitude in both Hegel and Kierkegaard. These relativistic conceptions of truth undermine its value as a definitive human objective. And as noted last week, Bernard Williams quotes Donald Davidson when he says that truth is, as G.E. Moore, Bernard Russell and Gottlob Frege maintained, and Alfred Tarski proved, an indefinable concept. Yet, as I have previously argued, the indefinability of both truth and the highest moral good is fortuitous. It is fortuitous because truth and the highest moral good share a property which recommend them as values, and that property is possibility or absence, which beckons value to further value in the will to value. The conclusion is that, like knowledge, truth has attributed value but not intrinsic value as an end in itself. Moreover, intrinsic values can be trivial, competing with others, thereby invalidating it as a final objective. But truth functions well as a relative concept or attitude in guiding human behavior. Truth also has a catalytic function in its enhancement of belief and its enabling of possibility. Yet more relevantly here, truth can qualify cognition in a dialectic with value states, and we can outline one aspect of that dialectic now. That is, in this analysis, it might be simplistic or naive in looking for only one feature as a single human objective. In the actual world, or in real minds, there are no pure states of cognition, affect, will and value. These are all composites. Values, for example, have varying degrees of volitional and affective content. And such is argued by Hilary Putnam in his The Collapse of the Fact-Value Dichotomy. Yet these mental states have significance beyond the academic world. All these states of cognition, affect, will and value represent momentous events in human life. Cognition conveys the facts of life, death and personal tragedy. Affect represents unbearable pain as well as pleasure and happiness. Will and volition express drive and commitment in people's lives. And value is a state which explains purpose, meaning, ethics and moral experience. And I describe the particular mode of value that is preferable to all the others as value sufficiency. Yet the character of reflective consciousness means that we have the capacity to affirm or deny such values, and this produces a principle in the form of an affirmation or the will to value or the value of value. This will to something or volition is also one of the fundamental constituents of mind or consciousness, and the will is constitutive of value, but as a means to an end it is idiosyncratic as a human objective. The will isn't a state that can be pursued as a goal. It's part of a process or means towards an end. And for that reason, even the will to value isn't the objective, although it's getting close to it. Yet the will is construed as an objective in certain Teutonic thinking in Schopenhauer and in Nietzsche. And a comparison can be made between Nietzsche's will to power, the will to will, and the will to value. Nietzsche's will to power was decried by Heidegger, who interpreted it as the will to will. And similarly, I dislike these connotations even in the notion of the will to value. So my preference is for terms such as the affirmation or the value of value. Yet all these considerations lead me to the shorthand notion of the will to value in pursuit of a human objective. And the will to value, or the value of value, or the pursuit of value leads to a certain sufficiency of value. Yet before concluding, we need to consider morals as one of mankind's highest expressions of value. Morality has traditionally been one of mankind's highest ideals and expressions. The neo-Kantian R.D. Ross attributes absolute priority of morals over all other concerns. Ronald Dworkin sees ethics as encompassing meaning, purpose, politics, and even state law. And Peter Singer regards the ethical life as also a meaningful life. And as a potential objective in life, morals contain some of the key noted features, such as, most significantly, ethical principles are values that guide moral action. Morality also has a cognitive component that guides the content of action, and morality employs the will as the motivation towards right action. Affect is also arguably a part of moral choice as consciousness, as well as compassion, care and love. And in the form of happiness, affect figures in some way in all theories of ethics. Yet in utilitarianism, happiness figures as its central principle of utility. But in recent weeks, I've been arguing against the adequacy and coherence of ethics. That is, as an account of both its own domain of morality and value, and also as an objective for human life. To start with, no adequate theory has been shown to establish a foundational ethical principle. Different theories of Aristotelian, Kantian, utilitarian and other ethics also contradict each other, and ethical principles have been shown to lead to less than human outcomes. Yet we need to explain the apparently universal and mandatory character of ethics. That is, the good will is really good, torturing babies is wrong, and the feeling that we must act in certain ways. My proposal was for a transitional value theory ethics in which moral value was reflected back onto the agent. This view was also able to provide a formal normative principle and explain diverse material moral action. Yet both this proposal and earlier critiques of ethics conclude with the concept of value. This leaves us with the task of both qualifying value and demonstrating its breadth. It's not only as principles of ethics that values can be seen at work. In religion, God is the highest, is the believer's highest conceivable value. A meaningful life is also worthwhile and a valuable life. Aesthetics also produces both and expresses values of symmetry and beauty. and every other human activity expresses value to some extent. We are examining the most prominent examples of these in these workshops, and all of these expressions of value must compete with each other. So I end up with the idea of a certain sufficiency of value, of which ethical fortitude is one example. And it is the purpose of these workshops to clarify and explain what that means. But it is the purpose of this workshop to conclude with the concept of value as the general principle. In conclusion, we can review what has been said. In considering the four candidate objectives of cognition, affect, will and value, we also had to consider the general and integrating category of consciousness. Consciousness was thereby an integrative concept which also included an appreciation of subjectivity. As particular expressions of cognition, affect, will and value, we examined the concepts of knowledge, truth, happiness, the idea of will, and morality or ethics. We find that despite their great advantages, all of these were lacking as definitive human objectives, and that particularly in ethics we were led back to a principle of value as a human objective. Yet in deference to both reality and the diversity of life, as well as to an ontology of consciousness, value was set into a dialectic with cognitive frameworks. And in this dialectic, independent and sufficient value was preferred to its dependence on externalities. Examples of sufficient value are ethical fortitude, magnanimity, courage, self-esteem and patience. Yet again, value sufficiency isn't a quantification or maximization of value. It must entail qualities like alterity, absence, ambivalence and need. Next week we will consider criteria for the priority of different kinds of value, like intrinsic or attributed values. And we are reminded of Nietzsche's task for the future to determine the rank and order among values. So let me have your comments or criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.